All right, let's go ahead and get started. So we just kind of went over all the life cycle methods in class-based components in React. Within the last year or so, React has been migrating from a purely class-based framework to more of a functional, using class-based components to using functional-based components. It's just easier instead of having to declare state in like a class and then pass that state down to via props in a function component. Everything is kind of now going forward functional-based components. But with that, we would lose some of the functionality that class-based components have, including, this dot set state, setting state, as well as, the component lifecycle methods like component did mount, component did update, component will update, or will unmount. So with that, React introduced what is known as hooks. These hooks come as a replacement to set state, as well as some component lifecycle methods. So can everyone see my screen? Yep. Is that a yes?
Yep.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So here I'm going to npm start. I'm going to kind of show you. Whoop. So I'm starting just a basic React, create React app inside of app.js. I have a functional based component. You can write it like this or use arrow functions. Oh, there's no, still works. Let's open up the console. So nothing's actually happening. So let's kind of look at a way we can utilize a functional-based component similar to a class-based component in those lifecycle methods. And let's try to translate that to what a functional-based component might look like. So in a functional-based component, it's literally just like a function. It runs. It's got a return statement, and then really nothing else happens in it. You can, run logic in here, but ideally, it's literally just like a function that returns some JSX. So first, if you wanted to set state or declare some state in a functional-based component, what method do we use?
Use state.
Yep. So use state, you've seen this before. Use state is one of those new hooks that were introduced in React when they are starting to migrate to a functional based component. So use state, I'm going to say, let's create some titles, set titles, and equals use state, and that's initially is null. And let's say on a render, so here we're going to be rendering some like articles or something from like an API. Actually, let's call it not photo. Let's call it photos, because I'm actually getting photos. So logo. So I've got the state of photos. It's initially set to null. And in place, so normally in a class-based component, when we wanted to make an API request, we would perform it, we'd execute it in a component did mount lifecycle method. But in functional-based components, we don't have access to those lifecycle components or lifecycle methods. So what is the name of this new hook called to essentially kind of not replace, but an alternative to class-based components lifecycle methods. Does anybody know?
Like something events or event something
It's actually useEffect.
effect.
Yep.
E. Sorry.
No, you're fine. So this useEffect is similar to those lifecycle methods that execute at certain points within a component's lifecycle. useEffect kind of combines some of those, like the component did mount, and I think the component did update or something like that. It combines those into one, and it's called the useEffect hook. So the useEffect hook is a function that takes in a callback. So that immediately executes like so. And I can console log use effect dot dot dot. If I come back here, it says useEffect hook, that useEffect method is executed. So executes once, and kind of that's it. Let's see, I'm gonna try to see if I can do kind of like the counter. No, we'll go ahead and we'll actually utilize some fake JSON data, like JSON placeholder. Is this it? Placeholder. Guide. So here, if I go here, JSON placeholder. So JSON placeholder is just an easy way to simulate an API request. And I'm going to use this photos ones. So this photos API, I go to JSON placeholder. Here, it returns some JSON, and I'm going to utilize that and render a bunch of photos here on my screen. So with that, let's actually create an API like we've been doing in news sites, but let's do it on the front end, just right here in this app. I don't want to create another folder just for instruction purposes. So I'm going to create an API called get photos API, and I'm going to do async await, async here, and I'm going to go let response equals await fetch. I can go to that specific API, that URL, and I can console log the response, and let's see if we get anything back. Response. All right. So now I need to execute this specific method, and I want to execute it when the component mounts. So I'm going to execute it. If I go here, so the useEffects method was executed. So I'm going to come in here and execute the get photos API. If I refresh it, I get a response back. Great. Now I can actually do let data equals response.json and await that. And then I can set photos to that data. I can actually first console log data to make sure I'm getting it back. So here we go. We have the set photos. Is that the photos or is that post? That's what I want. Photos. I want this one. So here we go. I got 50 photos. Album 1 photos. Cool. Is there another one? All right. So now I can actually set state to, I can set the state of photos to that data, which is an array. Uh-oh. So let's kill it.
Yeah, I forgot your empty.
Yep. So first thing I want to show you, so use effect right here. If it's only executed once right now, but when I set the state and let's console log data and run that, look at it. It's just executing. It's nonstop. It's almost like an infinite loop. And that is because in addition to having a callback, we can have some dependencies of when to execute this use effect as well. So essentially kind of what's happening is it's setting the state, the photos is changing, then the use effect is called again, the get photos API is called again, comes out here, sets the state, it just keeps on going in an infinite loop. So in addition to use effect taking in a callback function right here, it can take in some dependencies of, hey, when do you want this state to update? And if I only wanted to update once on the initial render, just like component did mount. So if I want to emulate component did mount, so just execute once and that's it. I can set an empty array right there and saying like, hey, and this extra argument is like telling you, hey, what element do you want it to depend on changing to actually make use effect update? So if I were to have some state in here, like just another value within this array, anytime that value would change, then the use effect would update. And we'll get to that in a second. So, but if I don't want it to update at all, I just want it to use effect to run on the very first render, like when the component mounts, I just have an empty array there. So it only renders once there. But if I didn't have any dependency on it, it's always, if I refresh, it's going to keep on executing infinitely. And again, that's because when I execute get photo API, comes into here, it updates the state. Anytime a state change happens in a component, it automatically re-renders, which calls the use effect to re-render, which again calls this API, which then continues to execute. Updates just in an infinite loop. So with that, I want to render those photos on the screen. So I can say like const show photos that takes in, photos, and then what does that look like? Album thumbnail. Okay, so I can, let photos array equals empty. I'm gonna do photos dot map title index. I can div. I can have like an image, an src. I want the, what is this, the thumbnail URL. So I can just say like the individual photo source equals photo dot thumbnail URL. Alt equals What should the alt be? Color. And then just like the index. And then, whoop, set the image. And I can set maybe like P and photo title maybe. Instead, I got, oh yeah, I got to return push or article photos array dot push there and there. And at the very end, I can return photos array. Then I can use some conditional photos and what am I doing? Show photos, execute. Oh, what happened? Oh. Need an encapsulating div. All right, that should work. What happened? Uh-oh. Cannot read property map of undefined. So it should say if photos exists.
Yeah, what's your initial state, Tom?
Should be null.
I don't think it's going to work null, though. Photos has to be empty.
Yeah, if you set the object, just as an empty object.
Should have. Still won't work if I do that. I can just say does not equal null. Huh. So I've got app.js, every property map of undefined. Let's see what that's going on.
Or is it supposed to be an empty list?
Let's see what's going on. Let me use. I'm going to just copy over code. I know that works.
Photos doesn't get set until on mount, does it?
Right here, gets it, and then should work. Titles. I'm going to change these to titles like I initially did. Where does it say set photos, set titles? That's weird that titles.map. Okay, cool. I wonder why that was. Like nothing in my code actually changed. Unless, yeah. Anyway, let's just kind of walk through. All right. So I've got this get photos API that goes out to photos and then gets a response, does response.json and sets the titles to that data up here. And then once that actually executes, then titles exists, and then it runs through the show titles, which passes in titles as the parameter or as an argument, and then it maps through the titles and does the index, thumbnail, and yeah, and the title. So this is just what's rendering right now. And so this is how you make, so like this empty array simulates like component did mount. So it's the empty array dependency. If the dependency right here is set to an empty array, it simulates the component did mount. So yeah, that second argument is literally what is dependent, or it tells, hey, useEffect, you're dependent on this specific state change to execute again. And right now it's sent to an empty array, so therefore it's like, hey, we're not going to execute it ever again, except the initial render, because it's not really dependent on anything anymore. So with that, let's actually simulate and the reason why it's taking forever, let's actually simulate a state change that executes that useEffect. So let's create another state called make API, and set make API, and initially set it to false. And then in here, well, it's actually, if titles exists, let's run that. Let's create a button. It says make API request. And then we can where's that button at? On click, we can execute like get titles, yeah. And then let's create a method, const get titles. That's sole purpose is to change this make API request to true. So we can set make API to true. So so right now this is rendering, like all that data is rendering. It's making that API request. But I don't want it to actually render until I click make API request. So inside my useEffect, I can say like, I can have a conditional statement. If make API is true, actually execute the make API request. And then what I want, when I want this useEffect to actually run again, only when the make API state changes. So it's ran the useEffect, comes in here, make API is false, so it's not executing that. If I click this button, the make API request, comes down here, get titles, runs in here, get titles, set make API to true. It sets the state of make API from false to true. Since the useEffect is dependent on, or I'm sorry, since the make API, yeah, I guess since the useEffect is dependent on the make API state changing, so this is changes from false to true, it will execute the useEffect again, and then it'll come in here, if make API is true, which it is now, then it'll get the API request. It'll actually execute it. So if I click it, so useEffect executed again, and now everything rendered. And I can create another just const. Because when I click that initially, is loading, set is loading. I'm going to use state. It's initially false. And then I'm going to say if is loading is true, it's going to set is loading to true. If it's false, it's going to say is loading initially value is false. So if I refresh it, it's not loading right now, but I want to actually change it when it's actually loading. So I can say in my API request, I can say set is loading to true. And then once it's done loading and set titles to the data, I can say set is loading to false. So right now it's false. I click, so it's loading right now. So it's getting the data. And now once the data comes back, I can set is loading back to false. That's just some other ways to do it, that part. But useEffect will only execute when the make API state changes. So I can, does anybody have any questions about the useEffect? So it kind of replaces the component did mount and the component will update. So the component will update only when the make API state changes right now.
Are we able to, like, I think it's only a class thing where you're able to extend, you know, this, whatever extends a component. Would you be able to extend the useEffect? Or how would you do something only once? You know, in the class base, you can have something that happens when it loads, and you can have it do something different when it gets updated.
Yep.
How would you do that in the useEffect if at this point here it's only triggered to do it once, you do just the empty array, but to have it when it updates, when something happens to make API, then it triggers the update. So how would you do both? Like if you wanted to do something once, one time, and then.
So like have like on the initial state change, have something else other than like titles change, or so you'd have, it would just all be in here. Like if you wanted something else to happen. So on the initial render, this still, like the useEffect still runs the very first time. And then you can have some additional, you can chain this, like you can add another piece of state is loaded. That's probably going to break everything, but. So I'm not quite sure, like how do you make another piece of data change in the useEffect? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. Well, it's just in the previous section when we were going over the class-based version of the lifecycle components.
Yep.
We were able to have two different components. One was the sorry, it wasn't on update. Will load, component will load, and then the other one was on update or update completed portion. So we were able to, in essence, do specific actions at those particular moments in time when it's at that point in its life cycle. I was just trying to figure out how it, so we'd have to actually kind of put all of that logic in there and try to split it out and decide it on our own within the use effect?
Yeah. So like the use effect only replaces like the component did mount, and I think the component will update method.
And
So-
And what?
it does unmount as well.
And unmount. Yep. Thank you.
So it's up to us to put in the logic inside to make any determination of like, hey, is this an unmount or is this a mount or is this an update?
Yeah. So, and that's all done inside like these conditionals. Like if some piece of data equals a certain value, then execute this or execute that type of thing.
It's all render based, right, Tom? And use effect fires every time that component re-renders. Whether or not it does anything is based off your dependency array and what you have inside of use effect.
Yes. So exactly. Thank you, Kobe. The use effect is always executes anytime the render method renders. So anytime you update, use effect will pretty much always execute, but it only executes like what you want it to execute only is dependent on what state you want it to depend on. Anybody have any questions about the use effect?
I'm still having a hard time liking the functional approach when there's state involved at all. Because I'm like, when I was watching you type this whole thing out, right, like for every like block 19 to 25 and 27 to 29, right, like these you're putting basically functions inside of a function. App is a function. It's starting to look like a class, but it's not called a class. It's just a function, but you're basically creating what looks like a class and at a high level view, looking at your code. This might just be preference, entirely preference, but it's just when I look at it, if I describe your app function, it looks like it's doing so many different things before it returns. And then classes, it just felt like everything had a separation of concerns to it. Like every method of that class did its own job, and then render did its own job.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like when there is a lot of state involved, like line 5 through 7, like you have a lot of state things that need to happen. It feels like a class just kind of outshines it to me. But I'm just trying to figure out, I've been trying to write it in the function form, but I just don't, when there's a lot of state involved, I just don't, it feels messy. I don't know why. I'm trying to understand why people are, why it's being said that like function is the way to, like the functional approach is the way to go, but I just can't see it. Or maybe it's just, maybe there's like a different kind of structure that we haven't gotten it, a different way of structuring this that we haven't got to yet. That's like, makes us write this even more cleanly, or if this is actually how it ends up looking at the end of the day. That's where I'm just stuck at.
I think it's for people who can't handle object-oriented programming and inheritance and all that, because I'm with you. I don't see how functional, unless you're writing something really tiny that doesn't need a class and doesn't use the features that it brings. So kind of like a helper component. I don't see like switching completely over to that. And I feel the same about Django. I'm like, class-based views is so much easier than function-based. And at function, you just end up with spaghetti code. Like one of the challenges, I had multiple use effects because there are different conditions. And it's like, well, this would be easier if I had it all consolidated on my update component method. But yeah, I don't get it either. I don't know what I'm missing.
So the reason why functional-based components are being more, they're gearing towards that is because historically in class-based components, you'd have your class at the very top and you'd have your state and you'd have your component did mount. But say, 7 layers deep, like this great great grandchild is a component that relies on some of that parents, like great parents state data. So with componented, historically, when your class component would render, it would have to pass that data all the way down to its child component, which would be a functional based component, generally speaking. So now, if this specific child component needs some specific data in its state, it can just execute the useEffect and useState right here instead of relying on its parent or great grandparent. That's kind of why it's and because go ahead.
I was gonna say it still sounds like it's trying to recreate it or do its own work instead of passing it down. But if it's gonna create it itself, then why would it even need to be passed down in the first place? So I mean, you can still use a class base, but just don't pass it down and let the child, the great grandchild, do its own figuring it out.
Be its own class component type of thing.
Well, it could still be a function, but create its own. If it's gonna, so what I just took of this was the 7th generation child may need something that this particular piece has in its state, and instead of passing it down, they wanted to do functional based, so you don't have to worry about passing it down, and then it passes it down to that 7th generation. Well, it doesn't pass anything down in a function based. So that 7th generation needs to figure it out itself, pull the data wherever it needs to get its data to set its own state. But you can still have it happen with a class based here. You just don't pass the data down. You don't have to pass state down in that class. You could pass certain state down to like maybe your 1st generation or 2nd generation, but you don't need to necessarily pass something down for your 7th generation. Would be my kind of thinking.
But like if your 7th generation child needed that, it was dependent on some state then you would need to have to pass it down. But that's kind of why. I mean, I'm going to stop